Oh, Ami, your son.
Yeah,
Your son-in-law.
yeah.
Okay. Hashem watch over him and all of our chayalim. Okay, so
Amen.
welcome back, everybody. If those of you who were with us right before Pesach may recall that we were discussing a number of shilas having to do with Yerusha, with inheritance. And one of the most important things that we're surmising is that a person needs a very strong will document. Make sure that you try to specify what your wishes are in your will. But then, okay, so now let's learn a new tshuva. Din bechor liyerusha v'ven shenolad la'aviv ger tzedek la'achar shenit gayer. Okay, we're going to learn about the law of a bechor who's born after many children. How can someone be a bechor after many of his siblings are born? Because the father was a Gentile and he converted to Judaism after his other children were born. Okay, so let's take a look at this scenario. It says, Ani ger tzedek, Toshav Miami. I am a righteous convert and a resident of Miami. Not that I don't know why that in the world that's relevant. Yeah, we need to know. The kodem shenhit gayarti chayiti v'nisuin ezrachiyim im ishti shehi Yehudiya. Before I converted, I was in a civil marriage with my current wife, who is Jewish. V'noldu lamnu kama yeladim, and we had many children. Just imagining this Cuban guy. I don't know, for some reason he's Cuban in my mind. Ula'achar she'it, yeah. Ula'achar she'it gayarti nolad lanu ben echad. And then I converted after many years of being married. We checked into a Chabad. Yeah, we checked in. We figured out that we want to be Jewish and we want to be from. My wife wants to become closer to Hashem. She brought me along. And okay. And then we had another child. We had a son. Ha'im yesh laben hazeh shenolad acharei she'itgayarti din bechor lekabel pishnai meha Yerusha. Does this latest son, this youngest son, have a status of a bechor to get a double portion because he was born the only child born after I converted? So the question, I would ask a more fundamental question. You should get the whole thing. Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Right. You're right. You see that Rav Sharaga is a traditionalist, and he is definitely a fan of giving the Bechor a double portion, but you don't have to. Okay, so let's take a look at the Gemara. The Gemara bebechoros nechluku Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish begoy shahayu lo banim begeyuto v'achar kach nitkayer v'nolad lo bein. So the Gemara actually has a debate about this very issue. Machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding a Gentile who had children when he was a Gentile, and then he converted and he had a son. Ha'im dino kibechor olo. Does he have the status of a bechor or not? Now, you should know that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were Jewish from birth. Reish Lakish himself was a Baal Tshuva. I don't know if that has any bearing on this, why they debated this issue. V'nifseka halacha b'shulchan aruch kedas Rabbi Yochanan she'ein lebein hazeh din bechor lenachala. The Shulchan Aruch records that this son that was born after conversion has no status of a bechor for inheritance. Zelu shona Shulchan Aruch. Hayu lo banim kishaya goy v'nitkayer ein lo din bechor lenachala. The person had children before he converted and then converted. The later children that are born to him, the firstborn does not have the status of a firstborn, meaning that this child that he has after he's converted does not have a din of a firstborn. Vatamhu shekevin shahayeladim ba'ui migoy v'goya he mityachsim acharav umemela havlad shanol achar sheyitkayer hu lo reshit ono. The reason is that when a person is a Gentile and he has children, the children go after the father for all purposes. When a man and a woman have a child, even in Gentile status, the child follows the father's lineage, and therefore the father, when he was a goy, already has children, and therefore this is not this newborn son that was born after he converted uh, is not his first strength, like the Torah calls the firstborn my first strength. So, in other words, the fact is that even children that I had when I was a goy are still my children, as far as this law is concerned. Ulafizat, but based on this discussion, chidesh b'nesivos hamishpat, the nesivos has a big chiddush. The im hagoy nasa Yehudiya v'holid mimena banim, that if the Gentile had married a Jewish woman and had children from her, ula'achar mikein hitkayer v'nolad lo od bein, and then he converted and had another son from that same woman, are kevin shabanav harishonim lo mityachsim acharav, ela achar imam v'lachein dinam ki Yehudim. He says, in that situation, the children are not considered his, the children that he had when he was a non-Jew. Because what is their status? They're Yidalach. And as Jews, they are really drawn after the mother's Hilchos, not at all after his. And the wife was Jewish. The kids that he had from her are for sure 100% Jewish. The question is, are they considered to be miyuchas to him or not, as far as inheritance? And so the Nesiva says, since they're not miyuchas to him in their status of Jewishness, they're also not miyuchas to him as far as inheritance goes. Nimsa shahabein shanola lo lachar sheitkayer hu haben harishon shemityaches acharav v'lachein dino kibachor lenachala. So it turns out that all subsequent children that he has after conversion are really the only children who are miyuchas, who are drawn as far as lineage after him, and therefore the firstborn he has at that point is truly a firstborn. V'chein kasav ha-minchas chinuch. That's what the Minchas Chinuch writes as well. So that's one side of the coin. Amnam ha-ma'arit al-gazi dan b'she'ela zu b'ben shenolad achar hagerus kishenasa aviv Yehudiya b'geyuto. I think the Maharat al-Ghazi was an Acharon, but I think he was an early Acharon. His commentary is published in the back of Maseches Bechoros, if I'm not mistaken. And he deliberates over this question about a son who's born after a man converts, when the father was married to a Jewish woman while he was still a Gentile. And again, he deliberates over this question. Initially, he thought to bring proof from a Talmud Yerushalmi that says, "Shekasuv sham lahedja shegoy shenasa Yehudiya v'holid banim ve'achar kach yitkayer v'holid od ben, din ha-ben achar shenitkayer kedin b'chol lenachal gam l'dat Reb Yochanan ayin sham." So the Yerushalmi seems to say the same thing that the Nesivos wrote, that even according to Reb Yochanan, that new child has the status of a Bechor. Ela de katav ha-maharit al-Gazi, kevin shaharambam lo hevi din zeh, mashma tesvira lei she'ein halacha kemo Yerushalmi hazeh, v'lachein ein la ben zeh din b'chor lenachala ayin sham she'arich bazeh. Maharit al-Gazi notes that the Rambam doesn't cite this halacha, does not quote this Yerushalmi, does not state any exceptions to Rabbi Yochanan's rule, and apparently it doesn't accept it. Omnam lahalacha nira shahabein shenolad achar sheitkayer u'b'chor lenachla. Notwithstanding the Maharit al-Ghazi, it seems to me that the halacha is like the Nesivos and the Minchas Chinuch, that newborn son does have a status of a Bechor, does have a status of a firstborn. And therefore, And by the way, he writes, "V'chein pasku ha'aruch hashulchan ba'pischei Choshen." This is how the Aruch HaShulchan paskins and Rav Bloy in the Pischei Choshen. He says, "Va'afal pisha marit al gazi tzidei bedasa ramen blosfer le'achi." Even though the Marit al Gazi seems to cite the Rambam as not being of that opinion, Mikol makom hama'ayin sham b'dvarav yired kol ma shekasav al tzad shegoy habal bas Yisrael haben goy ka'aviv. He says, but that's based on one opinion in the Gemara that says that when a man, a Gentile man, has relations with a non-Jewish woman, the child is a Gentile. Kevan sheyesh lo yachas achar aval kein ein lo b'no hanolad lo achar shenit kayer din b'chor ayin sham b'dvarav. And based on that opinion, the newborn son, after he converts, is not the firstborn, because the other children are miyuchas to him. Yesh lomar deledidan dekaimelan degoy habal bas Yisrael havlad Yehudi kamo imo uchamo sheherich hapis no, who is this? Sure, that is it Pischei Tshuva? Yep, yeah, Pischei Tshuva. He says, but we paskin not that way. We paskin that a child born of a mixed marriage, where the mother is Jewish and the father is not, child is 100% Jewish and is miyuchas after his mother. V'shekein stimas kol haposkim, and that's the consensus of all the poskim. Al kein yesh lanu lifso kedivrei hanasivos v'haminchas chinuch shahaben shenolad lo b'geyuto meYehudiyah eino mityaches acharav. And therefore, we paskin like the Nesivos of the Minchas Chinuch, that the child, the newborn child, is the Bechor, and that seems to be the final halacha. Now, I would have said that he's the sole heir, but I think what Rav Sharaga is trying to point out is that the other children, even though they're not meyuchas acharav, but the father should still pass on an inheritance to them nonetheless. But in recognizing that this newborn son is entitled to something special, treat him like a Bechor. That's how I would understand it. Okay. We're moving on now from inheritance and going on to the next tshuva. I would imagine so. But remember, you don't always have to abide by giving a double portion to your Bechor. You're not obligated to. If you want to give your firstborn a regular portion because of whatever circumstances, a lot of times in a family, the Bechor may not be married, may only have one child, and your thirdborn or your fourthborn has like 10 kids. And so you want to try and be more equitable because you know that your other children may need the inheritance more than the firstborn. Yeah, that's probably the best Eitzah. Okay. You're a good man, Moish. You live by what you preach. Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah, I guess the goal is, if you want to end up by the end, you've already given away all your money to your kids. That would be great, wouldn't it? So that, yeah. Of course. Yeah. And the kids don't want to give it back.
When you have the money, it's easy to take, hard to give. It's hard to give back. But it's hard.
Yeah.
Sorry about this, Rick.
Oh, Mama from the Train, isn't that the title of the movie? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay. Asiyat eskem mamoni be'inyan chiyuvei hanisuin. Okay, now we went from inheritance and death. Now we're getting into marriage. You're marrying off your kids. And now we have to make a negotiation right? The two sides have to negotiate on who's going to pay for what. So now we're getting into that. Okay, but here's the shaila. Ani omedet lihinasei b'nisuim shniyim v'yesh li rechush rav. The woman is asking a shaila. She says, I'm entering into my second marriage. I have a large estate. Maybe she's an almana, and she inherited a lot from her husband. V'ani me'unyenet shaharechush ya'avor liyaladai mehanusuin harishonim shali. I want to ensure that my estate will pass over to my children from my first marriage. V'lachein asiti haskem mamon eitzel orech din al zeh. So I went to a lawyer and I drew up a prenuptial agreement, which is standard, right? Pretty standard. Ayim haskem zeh takaf al pi halacha. Is this legally binding according to halacha? Or can my new husband say, I'm sorry, your prenuptial agreement has no legal standing based on the ketubah and based on the halacha. I control all your assets now. Not a good prognosis for the marriage if that's his claim. Okay, but in any event, let's take a look at the shaila. It could be that the woman is concerned that maybe she's depriving her new husband of his rights. So let's give the second husband, the benefit of the doubt. All right. Okay. So the tshuva is as follows. Keshaboyim b'nei hazug lahatnot tenoim kirtzonam b'kesher leba'alut al harachush shekol echad mehem mevi o yavi. He says when a couple come to create terms, a prenuptial agreement on who's going to control whose assets, v'chein shahaba lo yirash et ishto, and they also wish to include that the new husband, will not inherit his wife's estate. Imrotzim shatanoim halalu ye'asu al pi halacha. If they want that these conditions, their stipulations that they're making, should be halachically binding, im chayavim lahatnot devarim elu bein hakidushin lanesuin. They have to do so in between the kiddushin and the nisuin. This is a huge chiddush. I have never heard this being done before, but let's see what he says. Dahainu, acharei shehachatan natan lekala et tabaat, va'amar la hareyat mikudeshes li, v'lifnei hanisuin. And normally we do the kiddushin and the nisuin back to back. Both are done under the chuppah. The kiddushin is the groom presents the bride the ring and says hareyat mikudeshes li. And then immediately afterwards, we launch into Sheva Brachas, which is the Nisuin. But he says, Rav Shiraga, you have to make this, in order for this to be halachically binding, all of these prenuptial agreements, you have to finalize this agreement in between those two steps. Okay, so I know, I'm sure you can discuss it prior. Yeah. Right, no, of course. What's the source for this? So the Makor Baruch writes, because of Moran HaShulchan Aruch shenisun hainu kisheyavi ota letoch beito v'yityached imo v'yafrishenu lo v'yichud zehu nikra kinisa l'chuppah. The definition of nisuin is when you bring your wife into your house, have yichud with her, and set her aside and designate her as your exclusive wife. That's called entering the chuppah. Right? And there's different opinions as far as what this means, but it's got to be between the kiddushin and the nisuin. Aval im hitnu kain lifnei hakidushin o acharei hanisuin, but if these stipulations were only made before the kiddushin or after the nisuin, ein hatanoim ha'elu mo'ilim al pi halacha, then halachically these conditions are not legally binding, and that would certainly explain why we read the ketubah between the kiddushin and the nisuin, sort of like setting up all of the prenuptial documents. He says, "Ki lifnei hakiddushin ze davar shelo bala olam, kevin she'en lo ima shum zika o chiyav halachti." Setting this up before the kiddushin is not halachically binding, even if you sign all the papers, because you're signing on something that will take place and go into effect only once we're married. And it's what's called a davar shelo bala olam, something that has not yet come into existence. So you cannot negotiate, you can negotiate in principle on something that has not yet come into existence, but you can't consummate that agreement only until such time as the marriage exists. So we have to be legally married in order for us to consummate this prenuptial agreement. Kimavur b'shulchan aruch, v'chein kasef b'shut harashba v'nisflak b'ramah sham. V'chein lo yachol lasot et hatnoim anal acharei hachuppah. You also can't do it after the nisuin, after the chuppah. Why? Kevin sha'azi kvar nesua lo v'u kvar zacha b'rechusho v'yerushata. Because at that time, once the nisuin has taken place and she's now his fully incorporated wife in his home, he has immediately taken possession of all of her assets, and he becomes now her legal husband as far as Yerusha, inheriting her as well, should she predecease him. And therefore, the only way he can exclude himself from her assets is if he makes a special secondary kinyan. So he's not saying it's impossible to do it after the nisuin, but you'd have to do a new kinyan, and the Shulchan Aruch points that out as well. Never done this before. Never done this. Let's see. Let's see the final upshot, because like this even to me is a big surprise. Okay. Omnam bein hakidushin la nisuin. He says, however, between the kiddushin and the nisuin, kevin sha'adayin lo zacha birechusha u'biyerushasa. On the one hand, you're at a stage where the husband does not yet have financial rights in his wife's estate. Umeidach gisa ikavar kishura ito. But on the other hand, they're legally married to some degree, sha'asura lihinase la'acher, to the point where she cannot marry anyone else. At this stage, it's efficacious for them to make stipulations like this, and for the husband to, in advance, recuse himself from her estate. Even though the prenuptial agreement is stipulating something that runs contrary to the Torah, because according to Torah law, a husband inherits the wife who predeceases him. Even if you hold this as only a rabbinic law, Chachamim asu chizuk l'divrei k'shel Torah k'disa b'ksuvas. The Chachamim nonetheless strengthened this law and made it like a Torah law, that a husband inherits his wife. So even though that's true, that according to Torah law, a husband does inherit his wife, mikol makom lahalacha kaimilan kedas rov harishonim, harif harambam v'harash, shloshes amudei ha'ora. But nonetheless, the three great rishonim, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, all paskin shepasku keRabbi Yehuda, shehamasnal mashakasav b'Torah, b'davar shebemamon tanoi kayam. That even by stipulating about something that runs counter to the Torah, if it's purely a financial issue, then that's a legally binding agreement. In other words, if a person expressly says, I recuse myself from these funds, or I am taking double what the Torah would entitle me to, and that is agreed upon by the two parties, even if the Torah says counter that, it's legally binding. Because the only time that a person who tries to make a conditional statement that runs counter to the Torah, we say that condition is void, is only when it's non-financial in nature. But if it's financial in nature, then it's a legally binding agreement. Ubira Chazonish, and the Chazonish explained, Shesilo Kabal Mirushasa, Umechila zuchus eirisin. He says the Chazon Ish simply explains that it's a zuchus that the husband receives once he's presented his wife with kiddushin. But he has a right to be moichel that. He has a right to say, it's okay, I forego it. Va'az hachupa lo gomeres b'mikrizeh le'inyan Yerusha v'achilas peres. And therefore, once they've done that, they can proceed to the nisuin, to the chuppah, and the husband at that point, because he's already recused himself from it, will not be entitled to have a share in her estate, either when she's alive or after she passes away. It would have to be done in front of witnesses, but probably it's better to do it in a document. Probably they would have to sign it. Let's see what his final upshot is. Let's see the final paragraph. V'lachein zug sherotze lasos heske mamon yifnu l'rav musmach sheyasad lehem et hanusach b'shtar. And therefore, if a couple wants to have a prenuptial agreement on finances, on the sharing of finances during their second marriage, it could even be during a first marriage. It's more common for this to happen in a second marriage. It's just more common. When a couple's in their 20s, they usually have nothing anyway. But there are times when, let's say, the girl comes from a very wealthy family, the boy comes from a poor family, and they want to set out the financial arrangements in advance. So they should set everything up in a contract with the supervision of a Rav who knows halacha. And then after the groom presents the bride with the ring under the chuppah, and after they read the ksuva, then he should do a separate kinyan with a handkerchief, or with the pen, whatever it is, over the prenuptial document. Then they should sign the document under the chuppah. And then they should commence with the rest of the chuppah. Then everything will be according to halacha. But if they only sign the document before the chuppah, before the wedding day, then it has no halachic standing according to Jewish law. What about Dina de Malchusa Dina? What about all of that? He doesn't get into that. He doesn't discuss Dina de Malchusa Dina. Remember, he's in Eretz Yisrael. He may not fully buy into Dina de Malchusa Dina in Eretz Yisrael, like we talked about. But some people feel that you don't say Dina de Malchusa Dina for the Memshala, for the Israeli government. But that's what he's holding over here. That's what he's holding over here. I've never seen this done. I've never even inquired of a couple where I've officiated on the second marriage, even though I know, like I'm thinking of one specific case which I did a few years ago. It was clear as day to me that the wife had more assets than the husband, and it was a second marriage when they were both middle-aged, very much in love with each other, and I'm sure they had a prenuptial agreement. I'm absolutely certain. But they didn't ask me, I didn't ask them, and I usually am not involved in those things. It's usually completely independent of the Masadar Kiddushin. That's what he says. That's what he says. I'm not convinced that that's. I'm gonna, Belinetter, I'm gonna research this, see if there are other poskim who have different opinions. But I'm surprised at this psak. I'm not familiar with it at all. That doesn't. It could be that I just was ignorant up until now, but I've never heard of this happening before. Let me see if I can find out more information for you about this. Okay, we'll go on to the next tshuva tomorrow.